London, 1845. A city of opportunity and ruin, of splendor and scandal, where fortunes were made and lost on the whisper of a word. And no one knew this better than Anne Whitfield. At 30 years of age, Miss Anne Whitfield had long accepted her place in society. Spinster, wallflower, the woman whose name was penciled in on dance cards only when gentlemen felt particularly charitable or when their mothers insisted. Not that she minded. Or at least, that's what she told herself on nights like this, pressed against the wall of Lady Pennington's ballroom, watching younger women twirl in the arms of eligible bachelors. The truth was far more complex and far less dignified. Anne had once dreamed of romance, of stolen glances across crowded rooms and poetry written in her honor. She had imagined a love that transcended the boundaries of propriety, that burned bright and fierce in the darkness of London's most proper drawing rooms. But dreams, like youth, had their season. And hers had passed without ceremony or acknowledgement. Tonight was different, however. Tonight, the air seemed charged with possibility, as if the universe had finally remembered her existence. Tonight was the night the Duke of Ashbourne would choose a bride. Or so the whispers claimed. Anne watched him from across the room, this man who held the attention of every mother, daughter, and widow in London. Tall and imposing, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples, and eyes rumored to be the color of the sea during a storm. The Duke of Ashbourne was not simply wealthy or titled. He was legend incarnate. Unmarried at 35, with an estate that rivaled the crown's and a lineage that could be traced back to William the Conqueror, he was the prize that every debutante coveted and every father negotiated for. And he looked utterly, devastatingly bored. Anne found herself smiling at the irony. Here was a man who could have anything, or anyone, he desired, and yet he appeared as trapped as she felt. Perhaps they were not so different after all. A dangerous thought, that. She pushed away from the wall, determined to find her younger sister and ensure she wasn't making a spectacle of herself. At 17, Beatrice had all the beauty Anne lacked, and none of the sense she'd gained. It was as she made her way through the crowd that disaster struck. A servant brushed past her, tray of tea balanced precariously in his hands. Anne, ever graceful in her clumsiness, stepped back to avoid collision and found herself pressed against something solid and warm, something that felt suspiciously like a man. She turned, apology ready on her lips, only to find herself staring into the stormy eyes of the Duke of Ashbourne himself. Time slowed. The crowd seemed to part. And then, with a grace that defied explanation, Anne managed to do what no woman in London had ever accomplished. She sent the Duke's reputation and her teacup crashing to the floor. Hot tea splashed across his immaculate white waistcoat, staining the expensive fabric a damning shade of brown. Silence fell over the nearby crowd, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Anne Whitfield, spinster and social disaster, had just ruined the Duke of Ashbourne's evening attire, in front of everyone who mattered in London. Her life as she knew it was over. And yet, instead of shrinking away in horror, she found herself asking, with a nervous laugh that betrayed her anxiety, "Do you often enjoy infusions of pain and embarrassment, Your Grace? Or is this a special occasion?" The Duke of Ashbourne stared at her, his expression unreadable.
The Duke of Ashbourne stared at her, his expression unreadable. And then, to the astonishment of everyone present, including Anne herself, his lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "Only on Tuesdays, Miss Whitfield," she supplied, her cheeks burning with mortification. "Anne Whitfield, Miss Whitfield," he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name on his tongue. "How fortunate that today is indeed Tuesday."
And with those enigmatic words, he bowed slightly and walked away, leaving Anne standing in a puddle of tea and confusion, unaware that she had just set in motion a series of events that would scandalize London and change her life forever. For in a world where appearances were everything, Anne Whitfield had just become visible. And the Duke of Ashbourne never forgot a face, especially one that made him smile for the first time in years. The morning after the disaster at Lady Pennington's ball dawned bright and merciless, much like the gossip that had already spread through London's finest drawing rooms. Anne sat at the breakfast table, teacup clutched between trembling fingers, as her mother read aloud from Lady Whistledown's society papers. Last evening's entertainment at the Pennington residence provided more than the usual display of marriageable young ladies and their calculating mammas. One Miss Anne Whitfield, a spinster of no particular note until yesterday, managed to capture the Duke of Ashbourne's attention through the novel approach of baptizing his waistcoat with Darjeeling. What followed was even more remarkable. A smile from His Grace, who has been known to regard social functions with all the enthusiasm of a man attending his own execution. One wonders what other talents Miss Whitfield possesses that might warm a duke's cold heart. This author predicts an interesting season ahead. Ruined, Mrs. Whitfield moaned, dropping the paper as if it had personally offended her. You are completely, utterly ruined. Anne took a sip of her tea, surprised to find herself remarkably calm in the face of her social execution. I believe that's somewhat dramatic, Mother. I simply spilled tea. I didn't run naked through Mayfair. Don't be vulgar, her mother snapped. And don't pretend this is trivial. You humiliated the Duke of Ashbourne. He didn't seem particularly humiliated, Anne pointed out. In fact, he smiled. This gave her mother pause. He did, didn't he? Most peculiar. Perhaps he enjoys being scalded by hot beverages. Some gentlemen have strange predilections. Anne. Her mother looked scandalized, but there was a gleam of calculation in her eyes that Anne recognized all too well. You don't suppose? No, Anne said firmly, setting down her cup with more force than necessary. Whatever you're thinking, stop immediately. The Duke of Ashbourne has no interest in me beyond the momentary amusement I provided. By this afternoon, he will have forgotten my existence entirely. It was at that precise moment that the butler entered, bearing a silver tray upon which rested a single envelope. A message for Miss Whitfield, he announced with the gravity of a man delivering news of war. Anne accepted the envelope with a frown, noting the heavy paper and the wax seal bearing a crest she did not recognize. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter, her frown deepening as she read. Well, her mother demanded, patience never her strongest virtue. Who is it from? Anne looked up, her expression caught between disbelief and horror. The Duke of Ashbourne, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's invited me to take tea at his residence tomorrow afternoon. Her mother's teacup shattered against the floor, an echo of Anne's social catastrophe the night before. This cannot be happening, Mrs. Whitfield breathed, looking as though she might faint. The Duke of Ashbourne does not invite spinsters to tea. It simply isn't done. Apparently no one informed the Duke of this social constraint, Anne replied, still staring at the letter in her hands. He seems quite determined to break convention. You must accept, of course, her mother said, recovering with remarkable speed. This could be the opportunity of a lifetime. Anne felt a flicker of irritation. An opportunity for what exactly? To spill tea on his furniture as well, to provide him with more amusement at my expense. Don't be obtuse, Anne. The Duke of Ashbourne is the most eligible bachelor in England. If he has taken an interest in you, however inexplicable that may be, you must nurture it. I have no intention of nurturing anything with the Duke of Ashbourne, Anne said firmly, rising from her seat. I will decline his invitation. Her mother's face paled to the color of the tablecloth. You will do no such thing. You will accept, you will be charming, and you will secure our family's future. Anne stared at her mother, suddenly understanding the desperation behind her words. The Whitfield finances had been precarious for years, a fact her father tried valiantly to hide behind expensive waistcoats and membership to exclusive clubs. A connection to the Duke of Ashbourne would solve all their problems. But at what cost to Anne? I am not a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, she said softly. No, her mother agreed, eyes hard as flint. You are a daughter with a duty to her family, and you will fulfill that duty, Anne, whether you wish to or not. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and history. Anne looked down at the letter once more, at the bold, decisive handwriting that seemed to command rather than request her presence. Perhaps there was a third option, one that neither her mother nor the Duke had considered. Perhaps Anne Whitfield could attend this tea and make it clear that she was not to be toyed with, not to be pursued for novelty or amusement. She would go. She would be polite. And then she would extract herself from the Duke of Ashbourne's orbit before she was pulled in too deep to escape. Decision made, Anne folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. "I will accept his invitation," she said, ignoring her mother's triumphant smile. "But I make no promises beyond a single afternoon of conversation." What Anne did not say, what she could not articulate even to herself, was the strange flutter of excitement that had taken up residence beneath her breastbone. It was not hope. She was too old and too wise for such foolishness. But it was something dangerously close to curiosity. And in Anne's experience, curiosity was far more perilous than hope could ever be. The Duke of Ashbourne's London residence was exactly as intimidating as Anne had imagined. Situated in the heart of Mayfair, the imposing structure spoke of centuries of wealth and privilege, its façade a testament to the power of those who dwelled within. Anne sat in the carriage, hands folded tightly in her lap, attempting to quell the nervous energy that threatened to manifest in some new social disaster. "You look lovely," her sister Beatrice said, squeezing her hand encouragingly. Mother had insisted Beatrice accompany Anne as chaperone, though at 17 she hardly qualified for the role. "I look like a woman about to face her execution," Anne replied dryly. "Nonsense. Your new blue dress is most becoming, and your hair looks positively angelic in that style." Anne touched her carefully arranged curls self-consciously. She had allowed her lady's maid to spend an excessive amount of time on her appearance today, a concession to vanity she rarely permitted. "It doesn't matter how I look," she said firmly. "This is merely a social obligation, nothing more." Beatrice's smile was far too knowing for her age. "If you say so, dear sister." Before Anne could respond with the sharp retort forming on her tongue, the carriage door opened, and the Duke's footman extended his hand to assist her. Heart thundering in her chest, Anne descended from the carriage, Beatrice close behind her. They were led through grand double doors into a marble-floored entrance hall that could have comfortably housed their entire home. "His Grace awaits you in the blue drawing room," the butler announced, leading them through corridors adorned with priceless artwork and antiquities. Each step brought Anne closer to the inexplicable meeting that had consumed her thoughts for the past day and night. Why had the Duke invited her? What could he possibly want from a woman like her, plain, outspoken, and decidedly past her prime in the marriage market? The butler paused before a set of doors, knocked once, and then swung them open with practiced elegance. "Miss Anne Whitfield and Miss Beatrice Whitfield," he announced. And there, standing by the window with his back to the room, was the Duke of Ashbourne. He turned at their entrance, and Anne felt her breath catch in her throat. In the daylight, away from the crush of Lady Pennington's ballroom, he was even more striking. Tall and broad-shouldered, with features that seemed carved from marble by a master sculptor, he emanated power and authority without effort. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "How kind of you to accept my invitation." Anne cursed deeply, as protocol demanded. "Your Grace, may I present my sister, Miss Beatrice Whitfield, who accompanies me today." The Duke's gaze flickered briefly to Beatrice, acknowledging her with a polite nod before returning to Anne. "A pleasure, Miss Beatrice. Please, both of you, be seated. Tea will be served momentarily." They settled into chairs upholstered in silk the color of a summer sky, while the Duke took the seat opposite Anne. An uncomfortable silence descended, broken only when a maid entered with a tea tray laden with delicate porcelain and an assortment of small cakes. As the maid prepared to pour, the Duke raised his hand. "Thank you, I shall manage the service myself." The maid cursed and withdrew, leaving the three of them alone once more. The Duke reached for the teapot, a hint of amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "I thought perhaps it's safest if I controlled the tea distribution today, Miss Whitfield. My valet was most distressed by the damage to my waistcoat. A blush heated Anne's cheeks. I must apologize again for my clumsiness, Your Grace. It was unforgivably careless of me. On the contrary, he replied, carefully pouring amber liquid into a cup. I found it refreshingly honest. Sugar. I beg your pardon. In your tea, he clarified, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. Do you take sugar? Oh, yes, 1 lump, please. He added the sugar with surprising dexterity for a man of his station, then passed her the cup, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Anne felt the contact like a physical shock, nearly dropping the delicate porcelain. And you, Miss Beatrice? He asked, turning to her sister. The same, thank you, Beatrice replied, watching the interaction between Anne and the Duke with undisguised interest. Once all were served, the Duke leaned back in his chair, studying Anne with unnerving focus. You're wondering why I invited you here today. It wasn't a question, but Anne answered anyway. The thought had crossed my mind, Your Grace. I find you intriguing, Miss Whitfield. The blunt statement hung in the air between them, unexpected and unsettling. Intriguing, Anne echoed, uncertain how to respond to such directness. Yes. In a season filled with young ladies trained from birth to simper and agree with everything I say, you manage to insult my dignity, ruin my clothing, and make me laugh all in the space of 30 seconds. It was the most entertainment I've experienced at a society function in years. Anne set down her teacup with deliberate care. I'm delighted my humiliation provided you with amusement, Your Grace. If that will be all, perhaps my sister and I should. You misunderstand me, he interrupted, his expression suddenly serious. I'm not mocking you, Miss Whitfield. I'm complimenting your authenticity. Do you know how rare that quality is in our circles? I imagine about as rare as tact is in mine, Anne replied before she could stop herself. To her surprise, the Duke laughed, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his face entirely. Precisely why I find you fascinating. Beatrice, who had been following the exchange like a spectator at a tennis match, cleared her throat delicately. Your home is magnificent, Your Grace. Has your family owned it long? The Duke's attention shifted briefly to Beatrice. Since 1712. My great-great-grandfather won it in a card game, or so family legend claims. How romantic, Beatrice sighed. I'm not sure romantic is the word I would choose for gambling away one's ancestral home, Anne commented. Foolish, perhaps. Reckless, certainly. The previous owner was indeed foolish, the Duke agreed. My ancestor, however, was merely opportunistic, a quality I've inherited, some might say. His eyes returned to Anne's face, and she felt a sudden certainty that she was the opportunity he currently saw before him. The question was, what game was he playing and what were the stakes? I've monopolized enough of your afternoon, the Duke said abruptly, rising to his feet. But before you depart, I wonder if I might request the pleasure of your company at the Harrington Ball tomorrow evening. Anne blinked in surprise, certain she had misheard. Beatrice, beside her, made a small sound that might have been a squeal hastily disguised as a cough. I, Anne began, then faltered, unsure how to respond. That is, I had not planned to attend. Then I shall hope my invitation changes your plans, the Duke said, with a certainty that bordered on arrogance. I find myself eager to continue our conversation in a less intimate setting. The way he said intimate sent a shiver down Anne's spine, though whether of apprehension or anticipation, she couldn't quite determine. We would be delighted to attend, Your Grace, Beatrice answered for both of them, ignoring Anne's sharp glance. Excellent, the Duke said, his gaze never leaving Anne's face. Until tomorrow evening, then. And just like that, they were dismissed, escorted back through the grand hallways to their waiting carriage, Anne's head spinning with confusion and an emotion she refused to identify as pleasure. As the carriage pulled away from the Duke's residence, Beatrice turned to her, eyes wide with excitement. Do you realize what just happened? The Duke of Ashbourne has singled you out. You. This is unprecedented. This is madness, Anne corrected, staring out the window at the passing streets of Mayfair. He's clearly amusing himself at my expense. Some sort of game to alleviate his boredom. Beatrice shook her head emphatically. You didn't see the way he looked at you, Anne. That was not the expression of a man playing games. That was the expression of a man who has seen something he wants. And what would the great Duke of Ashbourne possibly want with me? Anne asked, voicing the question that had been tormenting her since his invitation arrived. I don't know, Beatrice admitted, but I think we're about to find out. Anne leaned back against the carriage seat, closing her eyes against the rush of possibilities that threatened to overwhelm her practical nature. One thing was certain. The Duke of Ashbourne had upended her carefully ordered world with nothing more than a smile and an invitation. And despite her better judgment, Anne found herself looking forward to tomorrow evening with something perilously close to anticipation. London society would never be the same, and neither, she feared, would Anne Whitfield. The Harrington Ball was, by all accounts, the event of the season. Every member of the ton who mattered had received an invitation, and those unfortunate enough to be excluded had invented sudden illnesses or urgent trips to the countryside to save face. Anne stood before her mirror, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. Her mother, seizing the unexpected opportunity presented by the Duke of Ashbourne's interest, had spared no expense in preparing Anne for the evening. A new gown of midnight blue silk, cut lower than Anne would have preferred, but still within the bounds of propriety, complemented her fair complexion and brought out the blue of her eyes. Her hair had been styled in an elaborate arrangement of curls and braids, interwoven with small pearl pins that caught the light when she moved. The effect was elegant, sophisticated, and utterly foreign to Anne's practical nature. You look magnificent, her mother declared, circling Anne with the calculating eye of a general surveying the battlefield. The Duke will not be able to take his eyes off you. Anne resisted the urge to tug at her bodice. Must we assume the Duke will even notice me tonight? Lady Harrington's ballroom will be crowded with beautiful young women, all vying for his attention, none of whom has received a personal invitation from His Grace, her mother reminded her smugly. Make no mistake, Anne. The Duke has chosen you for whatever reason. It is your duty to ensure he does not regret that choice. A prickle of irritation ran down Anne's spine. I am not a prize mare at auction, Mother. I will be polite to the Duke, as I would be to any gentleman of my acquaintance, but I will not simper or pretend to be something I am not. Her mother's lips thinned dangerously. You will be charming, Anne. You will be agreeable. And you will secure this connection for our family. The unspoken reality of their financial situation hung between them like a specter. Anne sighed, the fight draining out of her. I will do my best, Mother. That is all I can promise. It will have to suffice, Mrs. Whitfield said, adjusting one final curl before stepping back to admire her handiwork. Though heaven knows, your best has rarely been enough in matters of social grace. The barbed comment stung, as it was intended to, but Anne refused to show it. Years of her mother's disappointment had thickened her skin against such casual cruelty. The Harrington residence blazed with light as their carriage approached, every window a golden rectangle against the night sky. Footmen lined the entrance, and the sound of music and laughter spilled into the street, a tantalizing preview of the revelry within. Anne felt her stomach twist with nerves as they joined the line of carriages disgorging finely dressed guests. Beside her, Beatrice practically vibrated with excitement, her youth and beauty making her immune to the anxiety that plagued her older sister. I heard Lady Harrington imported musicians all the way from Vienna for tonight, Beatrice whispered as they approached the entrance. And the flowers. They say she's transformed the ballroom into a veritable garden. A waste of money for a single evening's entertainment, Anne replied absently, her eyes scanning the crowd for a particular tall figure with stormy eyes. Her mother pinched her arm discreetly but painfully. Remember, Anne. Charming. Anne forced a smile that felt more like a grimace and allowed herself to be led into the Harrington mansion, a riot of color, scent, and sound enveloping them as they crossed the threshold. The entrance hall alone was larger than their entire home, with a sweeping staircase that seemed designed specifically for dramatic entrances and exits. Footmen in powdered wigs directed guests toward the ballroom, where the orchestra was already playing a lively waltz. Anne's name was announced along with her mother's and sisters, though few heads turned at their arrival. The Whitfields, while respectable, were not the sort of family whose entrance caused a stir in such elite gatherings. Until now, perhaps. For as they moved deeper into the ballroom, Anne became aware of a curious phenomenon. Conversations faltered as they passed. Fans fluttered more rapidly. Speculative glances followed their progress across the polished floor. Word of the Duke of Ashbourne's interest had spread, it seemed. "I believe we're causing a sensation," Beatrice murmured, her smile bright with mischief. "Nonsense," Anne replied, though the evidence was difficult to ignore. "It's merely your imagination." "Is it my imagination that Lady Featherington just nearly sprained her neck trying to get a better look at you?" Beatrice challenged. "Or that Lord and Lady Pembroke are whispering behind their hands while staring directly at us?" Anne was spared the necessity of responding by the approach of their hostess, Lady Harrington, a woman known for her impeccable taste and formidable social power. Mrs. Whitfield, Miss Beatrice, she greeted them, her assessment of Anne so thorough it bordered on impropriety. "How delightful to see you this evening." "The pleasure is ours, Lady Harrington," Anne's mother responded with a curtsy. "A magnificent affair, as always." Lady Harrington's smile did not reach her eyes. "Indeed. And how fortunate that you were able to attend on such short notice. I understand your invitation was unexpected." The implication was clear. The Whitfields would not normally have been included on the guest list for such a prestigious event. Anne felt a flash of indignation on her family's behalf, quickly followed by confusion. If Lady Harrington had not sent the invitation, then who? "We are honored to be here," Anne said smoothly, before her mother could say something unfortunate. "Your home is truly a wonder, my lady." Lady Harrington's gaze sharpened. "Yes, well, some of us are born to such surroundings, Miss Whitfield. Others must. Find alternative paths to them." The insult was thinly veiled, and Anne felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't cause an immediate scandal, a deep voice interrupted from behind her. "Lady Harrington. Delightful as always to see the famous Harrington hospitality in action." Anne turned to find the Duke of Ashbourne standing mere feet away, his expression pleasant, but his eyes cold as he regarded their hostess. Lady Harrington's demeanor transformed instantly, her face softening into a smile of genuine warmth. "Your Grace, how wonderful that you could attend. I was just welcoming Miss Whitfield and her family." "So I observed," the Duke replied, his tone deceptively light. "Your legendary graciousness never fails to impress." Lady Harrington's smile faltered slightly as she registered the undercurrent of rebuke in his words. The Duke turned to Anne, and the change in his expression was striking. The coldness vanished, replaced by a warmth that sent an unexpected thrill through her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, taking her gloved hand and bowing over it, "you look enchanting this evening." Anne cursed, acutely aware of the many eyes watching their interaction. "Your Grace, thank you for the kind invitation." "The pleasure is entirely mine," he assured her, straightening to his considerable height. "I trust your journey here was comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you," Anne replied, struggling to maintain her composure under the intensity of his gaze. The Duke nodded to her mother and sister, acknowledging them with perfect politeness before returning his attention to Anne. "I wonder, Miss Whitfield, if I might claim your first dance of the evening." A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the nearby observers. The Duke of Ashbourne rarely danced at social functions, and when he did, it was never with unmarried ladies of little consequence like Anne Whitfield. Lady Harrington's face registered shock, then calculation, as she watched the exchange. "I would be honored, Your Grace," Anne managed to reply, her voice steadier than she felt. "Excellent," he said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" As Anne placed her hand on his sleeve, she caught a glimpse of her mother's face, alight with triumph and vindication. Beside her, Beatrice beamed with vicarious excitement. The orchestra had just begun a new set, the opening notes of a waltz filling the ballroom as the Duke led Anne onto the dance floor. Other couples parted to make way for them, conversation dying as all eyes turned to observe the unprecedented spectacle. Anne felt the weight of those stares like a physical pressure. "I believe we're causing a scandal, Your Grace," she murmured as he positioned himself before her, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features. "I find I rather enjoy scandals when they involve you, Miss Whitfield." And then he was leading her into the dance, his movements confident and graceful as they joined the whirling couples on the floor. Anne had always been a competent dancer, but never exceptional. Tonight, however, in the arms of the Duke, she felt as though she were floating, her feet barely touching the polished wood beneath them. "You dance beautifully," the Duke observed, guiding her through a turn with effortless precision. "You're an excellent leader, Your Grace," she replied, surprising herself with the flirtatious undertone in her voice. "It's difficult to misstep when one is so firmly directed." His lips quirked upward. "Are you suggesting, Miss Whitfield, that your infamous clumsiness is the fault of your previous partners?" Anne laughed, the sound startling her with its freedom. "I would never suggest such a thing, Your Grace. My clumsiness is entirely my own accomplishment, cultivated over many years of dedicated practice." His eyes crinkled at the corners, genuine amusement lighting his features. "Your honesty continues to delight me." They fell into a comfortable silence as the music swelled around them, bodies moving in perfect synchrony as though they had danced together 100 times before. Anne found herself relaxing into his hold, the tension in her shoulders easing as she allowed herself to enjoy the moment. "You must know that everyone is staring," she said after a while, unable to ignore the many eyes following their progress around the room. "Let them stare," he replied, his voice dropping to a register that sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm rather enjoying myself too much to care." "Aren't you?" Anne considered the question honestly. Despite her initial reluctance, despite her suspicion of his motives and her own better judgment, she was enjoying herself, more than she had at any social function in recent memory. "Yes," she admitted, "though I can't imagine why you've chosen to bestow such attention on me of all people." The Duke's expression turned serious, his eyes searching hers as they moved across the floor. "Perhaps that is precisely why I've chosen you, Miss Whitfield. Because you, unlike every other woman in this room, are not desperately trying to understand why I would." The music drew to a close before Anne could formulate a response to this unexpected declaration. The Duke stepped back, bowing formally as protocol demanded, though his eyes never left hers. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for nearby couples to hear. "I hope I may claim another before the evening ends." Anne cursed, her mind racing with confusion and something dangerously close to hope. "I would like that very much, Your Grace." He smiled, a private expression meant only for her, before offering his arm once more. "May I escort you back to your family?" As they made their way across the ballroom, Anne was acutely conscious of the whispers that followed them, the speculative glances and hastily hidden fans. By morning, their dance would be the talk of London, dissected and analyzed in every drawing room and tea parlor from Mayfair to St. James. The Duke of Ashbourne and Miss Anne Whitfield, an unlikely pairing that had suddenly become the most intriguing gossip of the season. And as Anne glanced up at the Duke's profile, stern and handsome in the candlelight, she couldn't help but wonder what game they were playing, and whether her heart might be the ultimate prize, or sacrifice. The morning after the Harrington ball brought exactly the deluge of gossip Anne had anticipated. By the time she descended for breakfast, 3 invitations had already arrived at the Whitfield residence, all for events to which they had previously received no acknowledgement, much less formal invitations. Anne found her mother in the breakfast room, reading Lady Whistledown's latest column with an expression of barely contained glee. "Listen to this, Anne," Mrs. Whitfield said, not bothering with a greeting. "This author observed a most unexpected pairing at Lady Harrington's ball last evening. The Duke of Ashbourne, long considered the most elusive prize of the marriage mart, bestowed not 1, but 2 waltzes upon Miss Anne Whitfield." Her mother looked up, eyes bright with satisfaction. 2 waltzes, Anne. You neglected to mention the second dance when you returned home last night. Anne busied herself with pouring a cup of tea, hoping to hide the blush that threatened to betray her. It slipped my mind. In truth, that second dance had been the most remarkable part of an already extraordinary evening. After returning her to her family following their first waltz, the Duke had disappeared for nearly an hour, leaving Anne to fend off curious inquiries from every quarter of the ballroom. Just as she'd begun to believe he had abandoned her to the mercy of London's gossips, he had reappeared at her side, claiming her for the supper dance with a possessiveness that sent tongues wagging throughout the assembly. During that second dance, their conversation had ventured into unexpected territory, touching on literature, philosophy, and even politics, subjects rarely deemed appropriate for ballroom discourse, particularly between an unmarried lady and gentleman. The Duke had seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, challenging and teasing her in equal measure until she'd forgotten her surroundings entirely, lost in the pleasure of intellectual stimulation. It was not something she was prepared to share with her mother, who would only see it as further evidence of the Duke's inexplicable interest rather than the connection Anne had felt building between them. Her mother continued reading from Lady Whistledown's column. This author cannot help but wonder what qualities Miss Whitfield possesses that have captured the attention of London's most discerning bachelor. Perhaps it is the very lack of artifice that sets her apart in a season overflowing with carefully cultivated debutantes. Whatever the reason, this author predicts a swift elevation in the Whitfield family's social standing, and an equally swift increase in the animosity directed at its eldest daughter. Mrs. Whitfield set down the paper with a satisfied smile. "We are made, Anne. Absolutely made. I wouldn't be so certain, Mother," Anne cautioned, taking a seat at the table. "The Duke's interest may be nothing more than momentary amusement. Men of his station are known to be fickle." Her mother waved away this practical observation. "Nonsense. 2 waltzes, Anne. No gentleman claims 2 waltzes with a lady unless his intentions are serious. Unless he wishes to create precisely the sort of speculation we're engaging in now," Anne pointed out. "The Duke may simply enjoy causing a stir in society." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "Why must you always assume the worst? Is it so difficult to believe that a man, even a duke, might find you worthy of his attention?" The question struck at the heart of Anne's insecurities, ones she normally kept safely buried beneath layers of practicality and acceptance of her place in the world. "Yes," she wanted to say, "it is difficult. Because I am 30 years old, plain of face, sharp of tongue, and without fortune or exceptional accomplishments to recommend me. Because men like the Duke of Ashbourne do not notice women like me unless they want something I cannot fathom." Instead, she simply sipped her tea and said, "I prefer to maintain realistic expectations, Mother." "Well, you may maintain whatever expectations you wish, Mrs." Whitfield declared, gathering the morning's invitations into a neat pile. "But we will accept every one of these invitations, and you will wear your new blue gown to Lady Danbury's soirée tomorrow evening. I have a feeling the Duke may be in attendance." Anne bit back a sigh, recognizing the futility of argument when her mother was in such a determined mood. "As you wish, Mother." The arrival of the post interrupted any further discussion. The butler entered bearing another silver tray, this one laden with an assortment of letters and one particular envelope that drew Anne's immediate attention. Heavy cream paper, wax seal bearing the crest of Ashbourne. Her heart gave a treacherous leap in her chest. "Another from the Duke," her mother observed, making no pretense of discretion. "Well, open it, Anne." With fingers that trembled slightly despite her best efforts at composure, Anne broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "Miss Whitfield, I find myself thinking of our conversations at Lady Harrington's ball with greater frequency than is perhaps wise. Your insights on Byron's later works were both refreshing and challenging, prompting me to revisit Childe Harold's Pilgrimage with new perspective. I wonder if you might permit me to continue our discussion in a less formal setting. My carriage will call for you at 2 o'clock this afternoon, should you consent to join me for a drive in Hyde Park. Your servant, Ashbourne Anne, folded the letter carefully, aware of her mother's expectant gaze. "Well?" Mrs. Whitfield demanded, patience clearly exhausted. "What does he say?" "He has invited me for a drive in Hyde Park this afternoon," Anne replied, unable to keep a note of confusion from her voice. Her mother's face lit with triumph. A public drive in the park, during the fashionable hour. "Oh, Anne, this is beyond my wildest hopes. He is declaring his interest for all of society to witness." "He is inviting me for a conversation about poetry, Mother," Anne corrected, though she knew the distinction would be meaningless to her mother. "Poetry," her mother scoffed. "Is that what he wrote? Among other things?" "Yes." Mrs. Whitfield reached for the letter. "Let me see." Anne held it back, a rare act of defiance that surprised them both. "No, Mother. The Duke's words were addressed to me, and they shall remain private." For a moment, it seemed her mother might insist, but then she settled back in her chair with a satisfied smile. "Very well. Keep your secrets, Anne, but know that a drive in Hyde Park with the Duke of Ashbourne is tantamount to a declaration of serious intent. We must prepare you immediately." The next 2 hours passed in a flurry of preparation that Anne found both exhausting and absurd. Her hair was arranged and rearranged, her complexion pinched and powdered, and her day dress scrutinized with an attention to detail usually reserved for royal inspections. By the time the Duke's carriage arrived, precisely at 2 o'clock, Anne felt like a doll that had been dressed and positioned by someone else's hands, rather than a woman of 30 embarking on a simple afternoon drive. The Duke himself stepped down from the carriage to greet her, a courtesy that set the watching servants aflutter. "Miss Whitfield," he said, bowing over her hand. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Your Grace," Anne replied, acutely conscious of her mother watching from behind the parlor curtains. "You're most kind." "Not kind," he corrected, helping her into the carriage with a gentle hand at her elbow. "Merely observant." The interior of the Duke's carriage was as luxurious as one would expect, the seats upholstered in soft leather and the fittings gleaming with polish. Anne settled herself on one side, while the Duke took his place opposite her. As the carriage pulled away from the Whitfield residence, Anne found herself alone with the most eligible bachelor in England, headed for the most public and socially significant venue in London during the hour when everyone who mattered would be in attendance. It was, by any measure, a situation both unprecedented and potentially ruinous. "I hope I didn't pull you away from anything important," the Duke said, as the carriage made its way through the streets of Mayfair. Anne smiled, relaxing slightly as they fell into conversation. "Nothing more taxing than listening to my mother read Lady Whistledown's latest speculation about our dance last night." "Ah," he said, his expression amused. "I imagine we featured prominently." "Indeed, Your Grace. Apparently you are discerning, and I am lacking in artifice." He laughed, the sound rich and warm in the confined space of the carriage. "A fair assessment, though woefully incomplete. Lady Whistledown failed to mention your sharp wit, your unexpected insights on Byron, or the fact that you stepped on my foot during our second waltz and then pretended it was entirely my fault." Anne gasped in mock outrage. "I did no such thing. You clearly misremember, sir. Do I?" he challenged, leaning forward slightly, his eyes alight with mischief. "Perhaps we should dance again soon, so you can demonstrate your flawless technique." "Perhaps we should," Anne agreed, surprising herself with her boldness. The Duke's smile deepened, creating a dimple in his left cheek that Anne had not noticed before. It transformed his face entirely, softening the aristocratic planes into something far more approachable and dangerously attractive. "I shall hold you to that, Miss Whitfield." The carriage turned onto the wide avenue leading to Hyde Park, joining the procession of elegant vehicles making their way to the fashionable drive. Anne felt a flutter of anxiety as she realized they were minutes away from becoming the center of attention for all of London society. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she ventured, needing to understand before they were subjected to public scrutiny. "Anything," he replied, his expression turning serious at her change in tone. "Why are you doing this? Taking me for a drive, dancing with me at balls? Surely you must know the speculation it's causing." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful. "Does it bother you?" "The speculation. I'm more concerned with understanding the reason behind it," Anne admitted. "I'm not naive, Your Grace. Men of your station don't single out women like me without purpose." "Women like you," he repeated, a strange edge to his voice. "And what sort of woman are you, Miss Whitfield?" Anne met his gaze directly. "I am 30 years old, unmarried, with no great beauty, fortune, or connections to recommend me. I am known, if I am known at all, for a tendency to speak my mind and an unfortunate propensity for social disasters. I am, in short, the last woman in London who should be receiving your attention." The Duke's expression darkened. "You've left out several qualities of significance." "Such as?" "Your intelligence," he said, counting off on his fingers. "Your wit. Your refreshing honesty. Your kindness to your sister. Your ability to make me laugh. Your surprising insights on literature. Shall I continue?" Anne felt heat rising to her cheeks. "You flatter me, Your Grace. I state facts, Miss Whitfield, something you claim to value." The carriage slowed as they entered the park, joining the parade of fashionable vehicles circling the drive at a stately pace. "You haven't answered my question," Anne persisted, aware that they would soon be visible to the creme of society. "Why are you doing this?" The Duke leaned back, regarding her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see too much. "Perhaps I enjoy your company, Miss Whitfield. Perhaps after years of being pursued for my title and fortune, I find your lack of artifice not merely refreshing, but essential. Perhaps I simply wish to know you better, without an ulterior motive beyond the pleasure of your conversation." Anne searched his face for signs of deception, but found only sincerity, a fact more disturbing than comforting. It would be easier to dismiss him if she believed he was playing some elaborate game. "I find that difficult to believe, Your Grace," she said honestly. His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "That is precisely why I believe it." Before Anne could respond to this circular logic, the carriage window was lowered, exposing them to the scrutiny of Hyde Park's fashionable occupants. The Duke, with casual authority, instructed his driver to proceed at a leisurely pace, ensuring maximum visibility for their unconventional pairing. The effect was immediate and precisely what Anne had feared. Heads turned, lorgnettes were raised, fans fluttered in shocked disbelief. The Duke of Ashbourne, driving out with Miss Anne Whitfield, as if she were the season's incomparable, rather than a confirmed spinster of 30 years. "I believe we're causing another scandal, Your Grace," Anne murmured, acutely conscious of the stares directed their way. The Duke's smile was unapologetic. "Good. London society has grown far too comfortable in its predictability." As their carriage made its slow circuit of the park, Anne found herself the object of more scrutiny than she had experienced in all her previous years combined. Ladies who had barely acknowledged her existence now offered elaborate waves and overly familiar greetings. Gentlemen who had never sought her hand for a country dance suddenly bowed deeply as they passed. It was as dizzying as it was transparent. And through it all, the Duke remained at her side, seemingly oblivious to the sensation they were causing, his attention focused entirely on Anne as they discussed everything from the changing architecture of London to the merits of Wordsworth over Coleridge. By the time they had completed their third circuit of the park, Anne felt a strange sense of defiance building within her. If London wished to stare, let them. If they wished to speculate about the Duke's interest in her, let them wonder. For the first time in her adult life, Anne Whitfield found herself the center of attention for something other than a social misstep. It was, she had to admit, not entirely unpleasant. As the afternoon light began to fade, the Duke instructed his driver to return to the Whitfield residence. Anne felt a pang of disappointment as their extraordinary outing drew to a close. "Have I answered your question satisfactorily, Miss Whitfield?" the Duke asked as the carriage turned onto her street. Anne considered. "Not entirely, Your Grace, but you've given me much to think about." "Good," he replied, his voice warm with approval. "I should hate to be entirely predictable." The carriage came to a stop before her home, and the Duke himself descended first to offer his hand in assistance. As Anne stepped down, she was acutely aware of the curtains twitching in neighboring houses, the servants pausing in their duties to observe this unprecedented visit. The Duke of Ashbourne, standing on their modest street, holding Anne Whitfield's hand as if she were precious cargo to be carefully handled. "Miss Whitfield," he said formally, for the benefit of their audience, "I have greatly enjoyed our afternoon. Might I call on you tomorrow?" Anne knew she should consult her mother, should demur, or at least pretend to check her social calendar. Instead, she heard herself say, "I would like that very much, Your Grace." His smile was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. "Until tomorrow, then." He bowed over her hand, his lips brushing her gloved knuckles in a gesture that sent a shiver up her arm and down her spine. And then he was gone, stepping back into his carriage with fluid grace, leaving Anne standing on her doorstep with the distinct impression that her life had somehow slipped its familiar moorings and was now adrift in uncharted waters. Waters that both terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. For the Duke of Ashbourne had not simply noticed Anne Whitfield. He seemed determined to court her, and that, more than any other development in her 30 years of life, was truly incomprehensible. The Duke's visits became a daily occurrence, as regular as the Morning Post and considerably more anticipated. Each afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, his carriage would arrive at the Whitfield residence, and he would spend exactly 1 hour in Anne's company, sometimes in the parlor under Mrs. Whitfield's watchful eye, sometimes in the small garden behind the house when the weather permitted. London society, predictably, was aflame with speculation. Lady Whistledown's column had elevated Anne from social nonentity to subject of intense scrutiny overnight, her every movement, garment, and utterance dissected with relentless attention to detail. Invitations flooded the Whitfield household, not just for Anne, but for the entire family. Suddenly, they were welcome at gatherings that had previously been well beyond their social reach. Mrs. Whitfield accepted them all with barely concealed triumph, parading her once overlooked eldest daughter through drawing rooms and ballrooms with the air of a general who had unexpectedly won a crucial battle. Anne endured it all with as much grace as she could muster, torn between amusement at the transparency of London's social climbers and genuine enjoyment of the Duke's company. For he was, against all expectations, remarkably easy to talk to. Beneath the austere facade he presented to society lurked a man of surprising depth, wit, and even vulnerability. Their conversations ranged from literature to politics, from architecture to philosophy, never faltering or growing stale. And yet, despite their growing intimacy, a question continued to plague Anne. Why her? What could the Duke of Ashbourne, who could have any woman in England, possibly want with Anne Whitfield? It was a question she finally gathered the courage to ask directly, 2 weeks into their unconventional courtship. They were sitting in the Whitfield garden, a modest space but well tended, with roses climbing the brick walls and a small fountain providing gentle background music. Mrs. Whitfield, having decided that a 30-year-old spinster could be trusted not to compromise herself in broad daylight, had left them alone, though the parlor windows overlooking the garden remained conspicuously uncurtained. "Your Grace," Anne began, then hesitated. The Duke, who had been describing his ancestral home in Derbyshire, paused. "Yes, Miss Whitfield. May I speak plainly?" He smiled. "When have you ever done otherwise?" "True enough," she acknowledged with a small laugh. "Then let me be direct. Why are you here? What purpose does this?" She gestured between them. "This acquaintance serve." The Duke's expression turned serious. "You still doubt my intentions." "I still fail to understand them," Anne corrected. "We've known each other for barely a fortnight, yet you call on me daily, engage me in conversation as if my opinions matter, and have effectively elevated my family's social standing through nothing more than your attention. It defies logic. Does it?" He leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "Is it so difficult to believe that I simply enjoy your company, that after years of being pursued for my title and fortune, I find your honesty refreshing, that I look forward to our conversations more than any other part of my day?" The intensity of his gaze made Anne's breath catch. "Yes," she said softly. It is difficult to believe, not because I doubt your sincerity, but because I know what I am, and what I am not. And what are you not, Miss Whitfield? He asked, his voice gentle but insistent. I am not beautiful, she said matter-of-factly. I am not accomplished in the ways society values. I am not wealthy or well-connected. I am not young and malleable. I am, in short, none of the things a man in your position typically seeks in a companion. The Duke was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and charged with emotion. You see yourself through society's distorted lens, Miss Whitfield. Allow me to offer another perspective. He shifted closer, close enough that Anne could detect the subtle scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something uniquely his own. You say you are not beautiful, but I find your eyes captivating, particularly when they flash with indignation or sparkle with wit. You say you are not accomplished, yet you converse with more intelligence and insight than any blue blood in London. You say you are not young and malleable, and for that I am profoundly grateful, for I have no interest in shaping a wife to suit my preferences. I prefer a woman who already knows her own mind. Anne felt her heart stutter at the word wife, but the Duke continued, apparently unaware of the effect his words were having. As for wealth and connections, I have more than enough of both for a dozen lifetimes. What I lack, what I have always lacked, is someone who sees me as a man rather than a title. Someone who challenges me rather than flatters me. Someone who makes me laugh rather than simpers at my jokes. He reached for her hand, his touch warm even through the barrier of her glove. And then I met you, Anne Whitfield, and found all of those qualities in one remarkable woman. Anne stared at him, speechless for perhaps the first time in her adult life. The Duke, Sebastian, as he had asked her to call him in private, seemed entirely sincere, his eyes holding hers without guile or artifice. I don't know what to say, she admitted finally. Say you'll continue to allow me to court you, he replied, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. Say you'll consider the possibility that my interest is genuine and my intentions honorable. Your intentions, she repeated, finding her voice at last. And what precisely are those intentions, Your Grace? I thought I had made them rather obvious, he said with a hint of his usual dry humor. But if you require explicit declaration, Miss Whitfield, then hear this. I intend to make you my Duchess. The world seemed to tilt beneath Anne's feet, though she was seated firmly on the garden bench. Surely she had misheard. Surely he could not mean. I see I've shocked you, the Duke observed, a touch of uncertainty crossing his features. Perhaps I've been too forward. You cannot be serious, Anne said, finding her voice at last. You cannot truly wish to marry me. Why not? Because it's absurd. You are the Duke of Ashbourne. I am nobody. You are Anne Whitfield, he corrected, his voice firm. And you are precisely who I wish to marry. We've known each other a fortnight, she protested. How can you possibly know such a thing? He smiled, a private expression that transformed his austere features. Some men require years to recognize what stands before them. I required only moments. The past 2 weeks have merely confirmed what I suspected from our first meeting. When I spilled tea on your waistcoat, Anne reminded him, still unable to believe the direction of their conversation. When you asked if I enjoyed infusions of pain and embarrassment, he clarified, his smile widening. No other woman in London would have dared. No other woman would have made me laugh when I should have been offended. No other woman would have looked at me as you did, not as the Duke of Ashbourne, but as a man who had tea dripping down his chest. Anne couldn't help the laugh that escaped her. You make it sound so romantic. It was in its way, he insisted, his eyes warm with affection. It was the moment I knew I had found someone extraordinary. A throat cleared loudly from the direction of the house, and Anne looked up to see her mother standing at the garden door, her expression a mixture of curiosity and impatience. The Duke, seeing the interruption, rose smoothly to his feet. I believe I've overstayed my welcome, he said. though his customary hour was not yet complete. Anne stood as well, her mind still reeling from his declaration. "Will you call tomorrow?" she asked, surprising herself with the eagerness in her voice. His smile was answer enough, but he replied nonetheless. Wild horses could not prevent it. As she watched him bow to her mother and take his leave, Anne felt a sense of unreality wash over her. The Duke of Ashbourne wished to marry her, Anne Whitfield. It was either the most romantic development of her life, or the cruelest jest fate had ever played upon her. And she was terrified to discover which. The Duke of Ashbourne's courtship of Miss Anne Whitfield progressed with the efficiency and determination that characterized all his endeavors. Within days of their garden conversation, he had formally requested permission to court her from Mr. Whitfield, a conversation that left her father simultaneously bewildered and delighted. Dinner invitations followed, not to the modest gatherings the Whitfields typically attended, but to the homes of the highest echelon of society. Anne found herself seated at tables with earls and countesses, viscounts and ambassadors, all watching her with barely concealed curiosity, wondering what magic this unremarkable spinster had worked to capture London's most eligible bachelor. The Duke, for his part, seemed oblivious to the speculation, his attention focused almost exclusively on Anne whenever they were in company together. He danced only with her at balls, conversed primarily with her at dinner parties, and made it abundantly clear to everyone in London that his interest was neither casual nor temporary. It should have been a dream come true. The kind of fairy tale that mothers told their daughters when instructing them on the importance of good posture and pleasant conversation. The plain spinster who captured a duke's heart through nothing more than wit and honesty. And yet, Anne found herself increasingly troubled, not by the Duke himself, Sebastian, as she had come to think of him in the privacy of her mind. His attention remained as gratifying as it was bewildering, but by the reaction of London society to their match. The women who had previously ignored her existence now sought her company with aggressive determination, peppering her with questions about the Duke's preferences and habits. Invitations arrived daily, not because Anne was suddenly considered worthy of inclusion, but because her presence might entice the Duke to attend as well. Most troubling of all were the whispers that followed her through ballrooms and drawing rooms, speculation about what arts she had employed to ensnare such a prize. What scandal might lurk in the Duke's past to explain his inexplicable choice? What tragedy had befallen him to drive him to such an unsuitable match? It was during Lady Danbury's musical evening, 3 weeks into their courtship, that matters came to a head. Anne had excused herself to the ladies' retiring room, in need of a moment's peace from the constant scrutiny that accompanied her every public appearance. As she was about to re-enter the hallway, she overheard voices on the other side of the door. Familiar voices discussing a familiar subject. "I simply cannot fathom it," Lady Featherington was saying, her tone dripping with disdain. "The Duke of Ashbourne and Miss Whitfield. It defies all reason." "There must be some explanation," another voice replied. "Lady Harrington," Anne recognized with a twist of her stomach. "No man of his standing chooses a plain aging spinster without cause." "Perhaps she's with child," a third voice suggested. Younger, more malicious. "Perhaps their courtship is merely a cover for a more sordid arrangement." Anne's hand froze on the doorknob, shock and humiliation washing over her in equal measure. "Impossible," Lady Harrington dismissed. "The Duke is far too careful for such an indiscretion. No, there must be another explanation." "I heard," Lady Featherington said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried clearly to Anne's straining ears, "that the Duke suffered a head injury while hunting last season. Nothing serious, but perhaps sufficient to impair his judgment." Laughter followed this cruel suggestion, light, tittering sounds that scraped against Anne's already raw emotions like knives. "Whatever the reason," the third voice said as the laughter subsided, "it cannot last. Sooner or later, the Duke will come to his senses and remember his station, and when he does, Miss Whitfield will find herself even more thoroughly on the shelf than before. Perhaps that's her aim," Lady Harrington suggested, "to secure as many advantages as possible before the inevitable end. A clever strategy, if a doomed one, More laughter, fading as the women moved down the hallway, unaware that the subject of their vicious speculation stood mere feet away, one hand pressed to her mouth to hold back a sound of distress. Anne waited until she was certain they had gone, then slipped out of the retiring room and made her way not back to the music room, but to the relative privacy of Lady Danbury's conservatory. She needed a moment, or several, to compose herself before facing the scrutiny of the assembled guests once more. The conservatory was blissfully empty, its glass walls revealing a clear night sky dotted with stars. Anne moved among the exotic plants, drawing deep breaths of the humid, flower-scented air, trying to calm the tumult of her emotions. She had known, of course, that their match was considered unusual, that many questioned the Duke's interest in her. But to hear it expressed in such crude, cruel terms, to be discussed as though she were some peculiar specimen of insect rather than a woman of flesh and blood, it was more painful than she had anticipated. Miss Whitfield. Anne turned with a start to find the Duke standing in the doorway of the conservatory, his expression concerned. "I've been looking for you," he said, stepping inside and letting the door close behind him. "You've been gone some time." Anne managed a smile that felt brittle even to her. "I needed a moment of quiet, Your Grace." The crush of people became somewhat overwhelming. He studied her face, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Something's wrong." It wasn't a question, and Anne didn't bother to deny it. Instead, she turned away, focusing her attention on a particularly vivid orchid. Its beauty somehow made her heart ache more acutely. "Tell me," the Duke said, moving to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but not so close as to breach propriety. Anne remained silent for a long moment, uncertain how to articulate the knot of emotions tangled in her chest. "It's nothing, truly," she said finally. "Just idle gossip, the sort of thing one must expect in London society." The Duke's jaw tightened. "What did you hear?" "Nothing I didn't already know," Anne replied, attempting lightness and failing miserably. "Merely confirmation that our attachment is considered unusual by certain segments of society. You mean it is considered inexplicable that I should choose you?" the Duke clarified, his voice carefully neutral. Anne nodded, not trusting herself to speak without revealing the depth of her hurt. "And this troubles you?" She turned to face him then, her composure hanging by a thread. "It would trouble anyone, Your Grace, to be discussed as though they were some form of social disease. To hear speculation about what possible affliction could drive a man of your station to consider a woman like me. To be reminded constantly and publicly of one's own inadequacies." The Duke's expression darkened with anger. "Who said these things?" "Give me their names, Anne." "It doesn't matter," she said wearily. "It's not one person or two. It's everyone. The entire ton is united in their bewilderment at your choice. And I cannot blame them, for I share it." "You still doubt me," he realized, hurt flashing across his features before he controlled it. "After all this time, you still cannot believe my feelings are genuine." "I believe that you believe them," Anne said carefully. "But I also believe that we have moved very quickly into something neither of us fully understands. And I cannot help but wonder if perhaps society is right to question." The Duke took a step back, as if her words had physically struck him. "Are you saying you wish to end our courtship?" "I'm saying I need to understand what this is," Anne replied, desperation lending her courage. "Why me, Sebastian? Of all the women in London, beautiful, accomplished, well-born women who would make suitable duchesses, why have you chosen to pursue me? There must be a reason beyond my ability to make you laugh or challenge your opinions on Byron." The Duke was silent for so long that Anne began to fear she had irreparably damaged something precious. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "You wish to know why I chose you," he said. "Very well. But not here, not with half of London eavesdropping behind potted palms. Tomorrow. Come to my home tomorrow afternoon at 3. I will tell you everything." "Everything," Anne echoed, uncertain what he meant. "Everything," he confirmed, his expression grave. "And then you can decide whether you wish our courtship to continue." Before she could respond, he bowed formally, every inch the Duke of Ashbourne rather than the Sebastian she had come to know. "Until tomorrow, Miss Whitfield." And then he was gone, leaving Anne alone among the exotic blooms, wondering if she had just sacrificed something irreplaceable on the altar of her insecurities. The following afternoon found Anne standing once more before the Duke of Ashbourne's imposing London residence, her stomach twisted with anxiety. She had slept poorly, replaying their conversation in the conservatory and wondering what revelations awaited her today. Beatrice had accompanied her as chaperone, though she now waited in the Duke's grand entrance hall while a butler led Anne to a different room than the one they had taken tea in during her first visit. This chamber was smaller, more intimate, clearly a private study rather than a public receiving room. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, leather-bound volumes on every conceivable subject. A massive desk dominated one end of the room, its surface neat but not empty, suggesting active use rather than mere display. It was, Anne realized, a glimpse into the Duke's private world, a space few were privileged to enter. The Duke himself stood by the window, his back to the door as Anne was shown in. He turned at the sound of her arrival, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Whitfield, thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she replied with a curtsy, suddenly formal and uncertain in this unfamiliar territory. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a pair of comfortable chairs arranged before the fireplace, where a small fire burned despite the mild weather. Anne seated herself, arranging her skirts with more attention than the task required, buying herself a moment to gather her composure. The Duke remained standing, seeming to gather his thoughts before he began. "You asked why I chose you," he said finally. "The answer is both simple and complex. But to understand it fully, you must first know something about me that few in London are aware of." He moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew a small portrait in an ornate silver frame. Returning to Anne, he handed it to her without explanation. Anne studied the miniature, which showed a young woman of perhaps 20 years. She was beautiful in a delicate way, with fair hair and a gentle smile that lit her eyes with warmth. Her name was Elizabeth, the Duke said quietly. "Lady Elizabeth Carrington. We were betrothed 7 years ago." Anne looked up sharply, surprise momentarily overriding her anxiety. "I didn't know you had been engaged before." "Few do," he confirmed, seating himself in the chair opposite hers. "We kept the arrangement private while awaiting the formal announcement. Elizabeth was." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. She was everything a young duke could want in a bride. Beautiful, accomplished, well-born. The daughter of an earl, trained from birth for the role of duchess. Anne felt a chill of foreboding. What happened? The Duke's eyes were distant, focused on memories rather than the present. She died, 3 weeks before our wedding was to be announced. A fever took her in the span of 5 days. "I'm so sorry," Anne said softly, genuinely moved by the pain evident in his voice. "You loved her very much." "That's the irony," the Duke replied, his gaze returning to Anne's face. "I respected her. I admired her beauty and grace. I believed we would make an excellent match. But love," he shook his head slowly. "I'm not certain I knew what love was then." He rose abruptly, moving to the fireplace and staring into the flames as he continued. "After Elizabeth's death, I threw myself into my duties, the estate, my parliamentary responsibilities. I became known as a man wholly devoted to his title and position, and I was content with that reputation." Anne watched him, sensing there was more to the story, waiting patiently for him to continue. "For 6 years I avoided the marriage mart entirely," he said after a moment. "Then, last season, my mother began to insist that I must marry, must secure the succession. So I returned to London, determined to find a suitable bride. Someone like Elizabeth, someone trained for the role, someone proper and appropriate and utterly predictable." He turned to face Anne, his expression softening. "And then I met you. Or rather, you spilled tea on my waistcoat and asked if I enjoyed pain and embarrassment." Despite the seriousness of the moment, Anne felt a smile tug at her lips. Not my finest hour. On the contrary, the Duke disagreed. It was exactly what I needed. In that moment, with hot tea seeping through my clothing and your horrified expression giving way to that improbable question, I laughed. Truly laughed, for what felt like the first time in 7 years. And I realized something profound. What? Anne asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He moved closer, kneeling before her chair so that their eyes were level, a breach of protocol so shocking that Anne could only stare at him in wonder. I realized that I didn't want a duchess, he said simply. I wanted a wife, a partner, someone who would make me laugh when I was being too serious, someone who would challenge me when I was being stubborn, someone who would see Sebastian, the man, not Ashbourne, the Duke. He took her hands in his touch warm and certain. I chose you, Anne Whitfield, because in a world of carefully constructed facades and social performances, you alone showed me authenticity. You alone made me feel like more than my title. You alone made me want more from marriage than duty and succession. Anne felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the raw honesty in his voice. The ton doesn't understand, he continued, his thumbs tracing gentle patterns on her palms. They cannot comprehend why I would choose a woman who has never simpered or flattered or manipulated to gain my attention. They cannot fathom the value I place on your honesty, your intelligence, your strength of character. But I don't give a damn what they understand. He released one of her hands to reach into his waistcoat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made Anne's heart skip several beats. I love you, Anne Whitfield, he said, opening the box to reveal a ring of stunning simplicity and beauty, a perfect sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the firelight and scattered it in rainbow fragments. Not because society deems you worthy of my attention, but because you have shown me what it means to be truly alive again. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Anne stared at the ring, at the man kneeling before her, at the earnest expression in his eyes that belied every cynical interpretation of his motives. In that moment, the whispers and speculation of London society seemed distant and meaningless. What mattered, all that mattered, was the truth she saw in Sebastian's face and the answering truth in her own heart. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Yes, I will marry you, Sebastian. His smile was like sunrise breaking across his austere features as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then society had best prepare itself, he said, rising to pull her gently to her feet. For I intend to spend the rest of my life scandalizing them with my unconventional choice and my evident happiness. And then he kissed her, a gentle meeting of lips that deepened into something that would have shocked the ton far more than their engagement ever could. Anne Whitfield, soon to be Her Grace the Duchess of Ashbourne, found she didn't care in the slightest. News of the engagement between the Duke of Ashbourne and Miss Anne Whitfield spread through London with the speed and destructive force of wildfire. By nightfall, every drawing room, club, and tea parlor from Mayfair to St. James buzzed with the shocking development. Lady Whistledown's column the following morning pulled no punches. This author can now confirm what many have suspected. The Duke of Ashbourne has indeed lost his senses entirely. Yesterday afternoon, His Grace formally proposed marriage to Miss Anne Whitfield, that most unlikely of recipients for ducal attention. Sources close to the family report that the engagement ring is a sapphire of considerable size and clarity, suggesting that His Grace's mental affliction has not extended to his financial judgment. One can only imagine the collective heart palpitations of London's marriage-minded mamas, who must now explain to their disappointed daughters why years of dancing lessons, elocution, and French conversation have proven less effective in securing the season's greatest prize than Miss Whitfield's unique talent for social disaster and blunt conversation. The wedding is set for 3 weeks hence at St. George's, Hanover Square. This author advises readers to secure their positions early, as the spectacle promises to draw crowds eager to witness either the social upset of the decade or the moment when the Duke regains his senses and flees the altar. Either outcome should prove most entertaining. Anne had expected mockery, disbelief, even hostility from society. What she hadn't anticipated was the sheer relentlessness of it. The pointed remarks thinly veiled as congratulations, the speculative glances that followed her everywhere, the sudden silence that fell whenever she entered a room. Had it not been for Sebastian's steadfast presence at her side, his hand firm at her elbow and his expression daring anyone to voice their disapproval aloud, she might have crumbled beneath the weight of society's judgment. Instead, she found reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. With each snide comment, each barely concealed smirk, Anne stood taller, spoke more confidently, and reminded herself of the truth Sebastian had shown her, that her worth was not determined by the approval of the ton, but by the love of the man who had chosen her above all others. The preparations for the wedding proceeded at a pace that left Anne breathless. The Duke had insisted on a short engagement, partly to minimize the time for gossip, and partly, he admitted with refreshing honesty, because he was impatient to make her his wife. 3 weeks, Anne had protested when he first suggested it. That's hardly enough time to prepare for a ducal wedding. Sebastian had merely smiled, that private expression that transformed his austere features into something approaching boyish charm. I have an army of servants, unlimited resources, and a burning desire to see you become the Duchess of Ashbourne before London society can mount an organized resistance. 3 weeks is more than sufficient. And so it proved to be. The Duke's staff, augmented by an army of modistas, florists, jewelers, and other specialized professionals, descended upon the Whitfield residence daily. Anne's trousseau was created with astonishing speed and exquisite attention to detail. Invitations were dispatched, replies received and catalogued, seating arrangements planned with the precision of a military campaign. Through it all, Sebastian remained a steady presence, calling on Anne daily despite the demands on his time, keeping her anchored amid the whirlwind of activity that threatened to sweep her away. It was during one such visit, a week before the wedding, that a potential disaster struck. Anne and Sebastian were taking tea in the Whitfield parlor, discussing the final details of the ceremony, when the butler entered with an unusually grave expression. "Your Grace, Miss Whitfield," he announced with careful neutrality. "Lady Ashbourne has arrived and requests an immediate audience." Anne felt the blood drain from her face. Lady Ashbourne, Sebastian's mother, the Dowager Duchess, had been conspicuously absent from all wedding preparations thus far. Her silence had been interpreted by London society as tacit disapproval of her son's choice of bride, an assumption Anne had tried not to dwell upon. Now, it seemed, the Dowager had decided to break her silence. Sebastian's expression hardened, but his voice remained calm. "Show her in, please." Anne smoothed her skirts nervously, wishing she were wearing something more impressive than the simple day dress she had chosen that morning. First impressions mattered, particularly with a woman of Lady Ashbourne's standing and influence. The Dowager Duchess swept into the room like a winter storm, cold, imperious, and impossible to ignore. Tall and elegant despite her 60 years, she bore a striking resemblance to her son, with the same storm-gray eyes and proud bearing. Her gown, though somber in color, was clearly the work of London's finest modiste, and the diamonds at her throat and ears spoke of generations of wealth and privilege. "Sebastian," she said, acknowledging her son with a nod before turning her penetrating gaze on Anne. "And this must be Miss Whitfield." Anne cursed deeply, years of social training carrying her through the moment despite the anxiety twisting her stomach. "Your Grace, it's an honor to meet you." The Dowager Duchess did not return the courtesy. Instead, she remained standing, effectively forcing Anne to rise as well. "I felt it necessary to see for myself," she said, her tone making it clear that what she saw did not impress her. "Mother," Sebastian's voice held a warning, "you are being rude to my fiancé." "Am I?" The Dowager's eyebrow arched in a gesture so reminiscent of her son that Anne might have smiled under different circumstances. "I merely wish to understand what has prompted my son to throw away centuries of family tradition and propriety for a match that has made him the laughingstock of London. Anne flinched as though struck, but Sebastian moved to stand beside her, his arm brushing hers in silent support. "I see you've been listening to gossip, Mother," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "How unlike you. When the gossip concerns the future of our family, I believe it merits attention," Lady Ashbourne replied coldly. "You have responsibilities, Sebastian, duties that transcend personal whim or temporary infatuation." "I am acutely aware of my duties," he countered, "including my duty to myself, to marry a woman I can respect and trust, a woman who will be a true partner rather than merely a suitable ornament for the title." The dowager's gaze flicked to Anne, dismissive and calculating in equal measure. "And you believe Miss Whitfield fulfills these requirements? A woman with no connections, no fortune, no notable accomplishments. A woman whose only distinction appears to be catching your eye through some means I cannot fathom." Anne's hand tightened on her teacup, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining her composure. Before Sebastian could respond, she set the cup down carefully and met the dowager's gaze directly. "You're quite right, Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have none of the traditional qualifications for the role of Duchess. I cannot claim distinguished ancestry or impressive connections. My fortune is modest at best, and my accomplishments are those of an ordinary gentlewoman rather than a great lady." The dowager's expression registered surprise at being addressed so directly, but Anne continued, drawing strength from Sebastian's presence beside her. "What I can offer your son, however, is something I believe he values more highly than any of those conventional attributes. I can offer him honesty without calculation, affection without agenda, support without smothering, and love without condition." "Sentiment," the dowager scoffed, though something flickered in her eyes. "Uncertainty, perhaps, or reluctant interest. The foundations of a ducal marriage must be more substantial than mere romantic notions." "I agree completely," Anne replied, surprising both the dowager and herself with her boldness. "But I would argue that mutual respect, trust, and genuine affection are far more substantial foundations than advantageous connections or impressive dowries. Those may build a suitable match on paper, but they cannot sustain a true partnership through life's inevitable challenges." The room fell silent, the dowager regarding Anne with a new expression, not warmth, certainly, but perhaps a grudging reassessment. Sebastian broke the silence, his voice softer than before. "I am marrying Anne, Mother, with or without your blessing, but I would prefer it to be with." Lady Ashbourne's gaze shifted to her son, studying him with the penetrating intensity that seemed to be a family trait. "You truly care for this woman," she said finally. It was not quite a question. "I love her," Sebastian corrected firmly, "and I will make her my Duchess in 1 week's time. The only question is whether you will stand with us or against us." The dowager drew herself up, every inch the aristocrat. "The Ashbournes have survived far worse than an unconventional marriage, Sebastian. I may not understand your choice, but I will not oppose it publicly. That would only add fuel to an already raging fire of gossip." It wasn't the wholehearted acceptance Anne might have hoped for, but it was considerably more than she had expected. She inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Grace." Lady Ashbourne turned to Anne once more, her expression stern but no longer openly hostile. "You have a great deal to learn before you can properly fulfill the role of Duchess of Ashbourne, Miss Whitfield. I suggest you prepare yourself for a challenging transition." "I welcome your guidance, Your Grace," Anne replied sincerely. "I have no illusions about the difficulties ahead." Something that might have been approval flickered briefly in the dowager's eyes. "At least you are not foolish," she acknowledged. "That is something, I suppose." She turned back to Sebastian. "I shall see you at dinner this evening, I presume." "Of course, Mother," he agreed, visibly relaxing now that the worst of the confrontation appeared to be over. With a final assessing glance at Anne, the Dowager Duchess departed as dramatically as she had arrived, leaving a wake of tension and uncertainty behind her. As soon as the door closed, Anne sank back onto the sofa, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Well," she said with a weak attempt at humor, "that was terrifying." Sebastian sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice warm with pride. "Most people wither under my mother's disapproval. You stood your ground admirably. I was shaking so hard I'm surprised the teacup didn't rattle right out of my hand," Anne admitted. He smiled, raising her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Anne. It's facing that fear and proceeding anyway. And you, my dear, have more courage than anyone I've ever known." Anne leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Do you think she'll ever accept me? Truly accept me, I mean." "Yes," Sebastian replied without hesitation. "Because she'll see what I see, that you are extraordinary in all the ways that truly matter. It may take time, but my mother is not unreasonable, merely protective of what she holds dear." "Including you," Anne said softly. "Including the family legacy," he corrected. "But once she sees that you enhance rather than diminish that legacy, she will come around. And in the meantime," he lifted her chin gently, ensuring she met his gaze. "In the meantime, you have me, completely and irrevocably." The certainty in his voice, the unwavering confidence in his eyes, chased away the last of Anne's doubts. Whatever challenges lay ahead, society's disapproval, the dowager's skepticism, the enormous responsibility of becoming a duchess, she would face them with Sebastian at her side. And that, she was beginning to believe, made all the difference in the world. The morning of Anne Whitfield's wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the heavens themselves approved of the unconventional union about to take place. Sunlight streamed through the windows of her bedchamber, illuminating the simple elegance of the wedding gown draped carefully across a chaise longue. Created by London's premier modiste in a record time of just 2 weeks, the gown was a masterpiece of understated sophistication. Ivory silk, embroidered with seed pearls and silver thread, fell in classical lines that flattered Anne's figure without ostentation. The veil, woven of Honiton lace, so fine it seemed spun from gossamer, awaited its place atop her carefully arranged curls. Anne stood at the window, watching the early morning activity in the street below, trying to calm the butterflies that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. In a few hours, she would no longer be Miss Anne Whitfield, spinster and social disaster, but her Grace, the Duchess of Ashbourne. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of Beatrice, already dressed for her role as bridesmaid in a gown of pale blue that set off her youthful beauty to perfection. "You're awake already," she observed, crossing the room to embrace her sister. "I thought I might need to rouse you, but I should have known better. You never could sleep when you were excited." "Or terrified," Anne replied with a nervous laugh. "I'm not entirely sure which emotion is dominant at the moment." Beatrice took her hands, squeezing them encouragingly. "You're marrying the man you love, who happens to adore you beyond all reason. Terror is entirely unnecessary." "I'm not afraid of marrying Sebastian," Anne clarified, moving to sit at her dressing table as her lady's maid entered to begin the complex process of styling her hair. "I'm afraid of the scrutiny, the expectations, the inevitable disappointment when I fail to live up to the standards of a duchess." Beatrice perched on the edge of the bed, her expression thoughtful. "Do you know what I've always admired most about you, Anne? My ability to turn any social gathering into an occasion for mortification," Anne suggested wryly. "Your authenticity," Beatrice corrected. "You've never pretended to be something you're not, never compromised your principles or character to please others. Even when it would have been easier, even when Mother practically begged you to be more conventional, you remained steadfastly Anne." "That's a charitable way of describing stubbornness," Anne replied, wincing slightly as the maid tugged at a particularly stubborn curl. "It's the truth," Beatrice insisted. "And it's precisely why the Duke loves you. Don't start changing now, when your authenticity has brought you everything you never dared to hope for." Anne met her sister's gaze in the mirror, touched by the wisdom beyond Beatrice's 17 years. "When did you become so insightful?" Beatrice grinned, her youthful exuberance returning. "I've always been brilliant. You were simply too busy being the sensible older sister to notice. Their laughter was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Whitfield, already dressed in a gown of lavender silk that had cost more than their quarterly household budget, a gift from the Duke that she had accepted with undisguised glee. "There's no time for frivolity," she announced, surveying Anne's progress with a critical eye. "The carriages will be here in 2 hours, and you are nowhere near ready. Martha, the curls should be looser around the face, more romantic, and make sure the pearl pins are secure. We can't have the bride's coiffure collapsing mid-ceremony." The maid bobbed a curtsy. "Yes, madam." Mrs. Whitfield moved closer, her expression softening as she regarded her eldest daughter. "You look well this morning, Anne. There's color in your cheeks." It was as close to maternal affection as Mrs. Whitfield typically managed, and Anne treasured the moment for its rarity. "Thank you, Mother. I must say, Mrs." Whitfield continued, inspecting the wedding gown with covetous fingers. "Madame Laurent has outdone herself with this creation. Not even Lady Jersey could find fault with it." "High praise indeed," Anne replied, smiling at her mother's reflection. For the next hour, Anne submitted to the ministrations of her maid, the critical suggestions of her mother, and the enthusiastic commentary of her sister as she was transformed from ordinary gentlewoman to bride. The gown, when finally settled over her head, fell in perfect folds, the bodice emphasizing the slenderness of her waist while modestly enhancing her figure. The veil, anchored with pearl-tipped pins and a small diamond tiara, another gift from Sebastian, completed the transformation. "Oh, Anne," Beatrice breathed, hands clasped beneath her chin, "you look absolutely beautiful." Anne turned to the looking-glass, hardly recognizing the elegant woman who stared back at her. The gown, the carefully arranged hair, the subtle flush of her cheeks, all combined to create an image far removed from her usual practical appearance. She was still not a conventional beauty, but there was a quiet radiance about her, a confidence that no modiste's skill could fabricate. "You'll do," Mrs. Whitfield pronounced, which from her was the highest praise imaginable. "The Duke will not be disappointed." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. "Mr." Whitfield's head appeared, his expression a mixture of pride and disbelief at the sight of his eldest daughter in her bridal finery. "The carriages have arrived," he announced, his voice suspiciously hoarse. "Are you ready, my dear?" Anne took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "Yes, Father. I'm ready." The journey to St. George's, Hanover Square, passed in a blur of anticipation and last-minute adjustments to Anne's veil and train. As their carriage approached the church, she was startled by the crowd that had gathered outside, not just invited guests, but curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle of the Duke of Ashbourne's unexpected marriage. "I had no idea there would be so many people," she murmured, suddenly apprehensive. Her father patted her hand reassuringly. "It's not every day that a duke takes a bride, especially one who has captured the imagination of London society as thoroughly as you have, my dear." Their carriage drew to a halt before the church steps, and footmen rushed forward to assist them. Anne emerged to a murmur of interest from the assembled spectators, clutching her father's arm perhaps more tightly than strictly necessary. The interior of the church was a vision of elegance, transformed by the Duke's staff into a flower-filled sanctuary that scented the air with roses and lilies. Every pew was filled with London's elite, their curious gazes following Anne's progress down the aisle with undisguised interest. And there, at the altar, stood Sebastian. His formal mourning attire emphasized the broad shoulders and tall frame that had first caught Anne's attention at Lady Pennington's ball, but it was his expression that stole her breath, a mixture of pride, love, and barely contained joy that erased any lingering doubts from her mind. This was right. This was where she belonged, not because society deemed it appropriate, but because Sebastian had chosen her, and she had chosen him with clear eyes and open hearts. The ceremony itself passed in a dreamlike state, the familiar words washing over Anne as she made her responses in a clear, steady voice that belied her internal trembling. When the moment came to exchange rings, Sebastian's hands were warm and sure around hers, his eyes never leaving her face as he slipped the wedding band onto her finger. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, his voice resonating through the hushed church. "With my body, I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods, I thee endow." And then it was done. The vicar pronounced them man and wife, Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, joined together before God and the most illustrious members of London society. As Sebastian led her back down the aisle, Anne caught glimpses of familiar faces in the crowd. Lady Harrington, whose snub had precipitated their first meeting, looking thoroughly disgruntled. Lady Featherington, whose cruel gossip Anne had overheard, watching with narrow-eyed speculation. The Dowager Duchess, her expression inscrutable, but no longer openly hostile. And beyond them, the rest of the ton, those who had ignored or dismissed Anne for years, now rising to pay homage to the new Duchess of Ashbourne. The irony was not lost on Anne, but neither was it important. What mattered was the man beside her, his hand firm around hers, guiding her into their shared future with the same confidence and determination that had characterized their whirlwind courtship. The wedding breakfast, held at the Duke's London residence, was a spectacle of wealth and taste that would be discussed in drawing rooms for weeks to come. Crystal sparkled, silver gleamed, and champagne flowed freely as the cream of society offered their congratulations to the newly wedded couple. Anne received their good wishes with a grace that surprised even herself, finding strength in Sebastian's steady presence and the genuine affection evident in his every glance. It was only as the celebration began to wind down that Anne found a moment of quiet, slipping away to the small library where she and Sebastian had spent many pleasant hours during their courtship. She needed a moment to breathe, to absorb the reality of the day's events. "You're hiding," a familiar voice observed from the doorway. Anne turned to find Sebastian watching her, his expression fond and understanding. Taking a strategic retreat, she corrected with a smile. "There's a difference." He crossed the room to join her, taking her hands in his. "Are you overwhelmed?" "A little," she admitted. "It's not every day a spinster becomes a duchess. It's not every day I acquire a wife," he pointed out, drawing her closer. "Particularly one who continues to fascinate me more with each passing hour." Anne leaned into his embrace, allowing herself to enjoy the solid strength of him. "Do you think they'll ever accept me? Truly accept me, not just tolerate me because of you?" "Some will," Sebastian replied honestly. "Others won't, but their acceptance is irrelevant. What matters is this: us, the life we build together." He tilted her chin up gently, ensuring she met his gaze. "I didn't marry you for society's approval, Anne. I married you because you make me happier than I ever believed possible. Because you see me, not the Duke, not the title, but me." Anne felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, moved by the simple truth in his words. "I love you," she said softly, the declaration still new enough to make her heart race. His smile was answer enough, but he replied nonetheless, his voice low and intimate. "And I love you, Duchess, more than I have words to express." When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and challenges faced together. It was the kiss of a man who had found his match, his partner, his equal in all the ways that truly mattered. And Anne Ashbourne, Duchess of Ashbourne, kissed him back with equal fervor, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Society might whisper, the ton might gossip, Lady Whistledown might fill her column with speculation and innuendo. But none of it mattered, not when measured against the love of the man who had seen beyond appearances and conventions to the heart of what truly mattered. For in a world obsessed with proper matches and advantageous connections, the Duke of Ashbourne had chosen love. And that, Anne reflected as she melted into her husband's embrace, was the greatest scandal and the greatest triumph of all. 1 year later, the drawing room of Ashbourne House bustled with activity as final preparations were made for the evening's entertainment. Footmen arranged flowers in crystal vases, maids adjusted the placement of candelabras, and the butler supervised it all with an eagle eye for detail. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashbourne, consulting a list with her housekeeper while simultaneously issuing instructions about the music selection for dancing. If anyone had told Anne Whitfield a year ago that she would be hosting the most anticipated ball of the London season, she would have laughed at the absurdity. And yet, here she was, transformed from social disaster to social arbiter in the space of 12 remarkable months. The transformation had not been without challenges. Her first weeks as Duchess had been a baptism by fire, as she navigated the complexities of managing a ducal household, learned the names and histories of what felt like hundreds of servants, and attempted to memorize the intricate web of relationships that constituted London's high society. There had been missteps, of course, moments when she confused a viscount with an earl, or served the wrong wine with a particular course, or spoke too frankly in company accustomed to polite fabrications. But Sebastian had stood by her through each stumble, his unwavering support giving her the confidence to learn from her mistakes rather than being defeated by them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, London had begun to change its tune about the unconventional Duchess. Her natural intelligence and quick wit made her a formidable conversationalist. Her lack of pretension endeared her to those weary of society's endless posturing. Her genuine interest in the challenges facing those less fortunate than herself led to charitable initiatives that earned respect from quarters previously closed to her. Even the Dowager Duchess, initially so skeptical of her son's choice, had gradually thawed toward her daughter-in-law. Their relationship was not without tension, but it had evolved into something approaching mutual respect, particularly after Anne had successfully navigated her first season as hostess at the Ashbourne country estate. A year of marriage had changed Anne in subtle ways. She carried herself with more confidence, dressed with more sophistication, and had learned when to speak her mind and when discretion was the better part of valor. But at her core, she remained the woman Sebastian had fallen in love with, honest, intelligent, and refreshingly authentic in a world of careful fabrications. "Your Grace," the housekeeper's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Where would you like the additional seating placed?" Anne considered the layout of the ballroom. "Near the east wall, I think, Mrs. Winters. Far enough from the orchestra to allow conversation, but with a clear view of the dancing." "Very good, Your Grace, Mrs." Winters replied with a nod of approval. "A most sensible arrangement." Anne smiled, still occasionally surprised by the deference shown to her position. "Thank you. That will be all for now." As the housekeeper departed, Anne felt a familiar presence behind her, strong arms encircling her waist as Sebastian's chin came to rest atop her head. "You're working too hard," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The staff is perfectly capable of managing the details without your constant supervision." Anne leaned back against him, allowing herself a moment of repose in the midst of the day's frenetic activity. "I know, but it's our first anniversary ball. I want everything to be perfect." Sebastian turned her in his arms, regarding her with the mixture of amusement and adoration that never failed to warm her heart. The ball could be held in a stable with hay bales for seating, and it would still be perfect, because you are hosting it. "Your bias is showing, Your Grace," she teased, reaching up to straighten his cravat. "Not everyone shares your inexplicably positive opinion of me." "Their opinion is irrelevant," he reminded her, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Though I note that Lady Jersey practically simpered at you during the Pembroke dinner last week." A far cry from her initial disdain. Anne laughed, the sound echoing in the grand drawing room. "She's realized I have no designs on her position as social arbiter. I'm still far too practical for such ambitions." "You underestimate yourself, as always," Sebastian observed, his expression growing more serious. "You've accomplished more in 1 year as Duchess than many achieve in a lifetime. The orphanage initiative alone would be enough to secure your place in society, even without the advantages of my title." The orphanage had been Anne's first major project as Duchess, a cause close to her heart due to her own childhood experiences with a distant cousin who had been orphaned and left virtually destitute. Using the resources and connections that came with her new position, she had established a foundation to provide education and apprenticeships for orphaned children, giving them practical skills and opportunities that would allow them to build stable, independent lives. The project had initially raised eyebrows among those who expected the new Duchess to focus on more traditional charitable endeavors. But its early success had silenced most critics. Even the Dowager Duchess had grudgingly acknowledged the merit of the initiative, particularly after seeing the transformation in the first group of children to benefit from the program. "It's the work that matters, not the recognition," Anne said, though she couldn't deny the satisfaction she felt when recalling the faces of the children who had been given hope and opportunity through her efforts. Sebastian smiled, the private expression that still made her heart skip a beat, even after a year of marriage. "And that, my love, is precisely why you make such an exceptional Duchess. Your concern is for the substance, not the appearance." A discreet cough interrupted their moment of intimacy. "Forgive me, Your Grace," the butler announced from the doorway. "Lady Ashbourne has arrived and asks if you are at home to visitors." Anne exchanged a quick glance with Sebastian. His mother had not been expected until the ball that evening. "Of course, Thomas," Anne replied smoothly. "Please show her to the blue drawing room. We'll join her directly." As the butler withdrew, Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "I wonder what brings Mother here at this hour. Perhaps she's come to offer last-minute advice on the proper arrangement of the receiving line," Anne suggested with a touch of wry humor. "She does have opinions on the subject." Sebastian laughed, offering his arm with formal courtesy that was belied by the twinkle in his eye. "Shall we face the Inquisition together, Duchess?" "I wouldn't have it any other way, Duke," she replied, placing her hand on his sleeve. They found the Dowager Duchess standing by the window of the blue drawing room, her regal posture as impeccable as always. She turned at their entrance, her expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Mother," Sebastian greeted her, bending to kiss her cheek. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "I apologize for arriving unannounced," she replied, nodding to Anne with more warmth than she had shown a year ago. "I know you must be busy with preparations for this evening's festivities." "Not too busy for family," Anne assured her, gesturing toward the comfortable seating arrangement near the fireplace. "Please, won't you sit? Shall I ring for tea?" "No, thank you," the Dowager replied, though she did take the offered seat. "I won't stay long. I merely wanted to speak with you both before the ball this evening." Sebastian settled beside Anne on the sofa opposite his mother, his expression curious but patient. "We're listening, Mother." The Dowager Duchess smoothed her already immaculate skirts, a gesture Anne had come to recognize as a sign of rare nervousness. "I owe you both an apology," she said finally, the words seeming to cost her considerable effort. "Particularly you, Anne." Anne blinked in surprise, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented development. "I was wrong," the Dowager continued, her voice growing stronger as she committed to her purpose. "When Sebastian announced his intention to marry you, I was convinced it was a mistake. I believed that a duke required a wife trained from birth for the role, someone with the right connections, the right background, the right—" She paused, seemingly searching for the right word. "Pedigree." Sebastian's hand tightened around Anne's, but he remained silent, allowing his mother to continue. "I feared you would embarrass the family, diminish the standing of a title that has been maintained through careful alliances for generations," the Dowager admitted. "I could not see beyond my own prejudices to recognize the qualities that my son so clearly valued in you." She met Anne's gaze directly, gray eyes so like her son's showing uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I was wrong, Anne. This past year has proven that beyond any doubt. You have brought honor to the Ashbourne name, not through birth or connections, but through intelligence, dedication, and genuine care for others." Anne felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, moved by the sincerity in the older woman's voice. "Your opinion means a great deal to me," she said softly. "I've always hoped to earn your approval, even when it seemed impossible." "You have more than earned it," the Dowager replied, her voice gentler than Anne had ever heard it. "You have earned my respect and my gratitude for the happiness you have brought my son." She turned to Sebastian, her expression softening further. "You chose wisely, my son. Far more wisely than I would have chosen for you. I am sorry for my initial opposition to your marriage." Sebastian's surprise was evident, but his voice remained steady as he responded. "Thank you, Mother. though I never doubted Anne would prove her worth, if given the opportunity. The dowager reached into her reticule, withdrawing a small velvet box. I brought something for you, Anne. A gift, in recognition of your first anniversary, and she hesitated, my acceptance into our family. She extended the box toward Anne, who accepted it with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled on a bed of white silk, lay a necklace of extraordinary beauty, a cascade of diamonds surrounding a perfect sapphire that matched Anne's engagement ring. This has been in the Ashbourne family for 6 generations, the dowager explained, traditionally worn by the Duchess on significant occasions. I should have given it to you on your wedding day, but I was too stubborn, too blinded by my own expectations. It's beautiful, Anne breathed, genuinely moved by both the gift and the gesture it represented. It belongs to you now, the dowager said firmly, as does the title you have honored this past year. Anne looked up, meeting the older woman's gaze with newfound understanding. For the first time, she saw beyond the formidable exterior to the woman beneath, one who had dedicated her life to preserving the legacy of the family she had married into, who had raised a son worthy of that legacy, and who was now, in her own way, acknowledging that traditions could evolve without being diminished. Thank you, she said simply, knowing that between them the words carried far more meaning than their surface simplicity might suggest. The Dowager Duchess nodded once, emotion briefly visible in her eyes before her customary composure reasserted itself. She rose with characteristic grace. I should leave you to your preparations. I look forward to this evening's celebration. Sebastian stood, offering his arm to his mother. I'll see you out. As they left the room, Anne remained seated, the velvet box open in her hands, the necklace catching the afternoon light in prismatic fragments. It represented more than merely jewelry or tradition. It was a symbol of acceptance, of belonging, of having finally found her place in a world that had once seemed determined to exclude her. Later that evening, as she stood beside Sebastian in the receiving line, the dowager's necklace gracing her throat and her husband's hand warm at her waist, Anne greeted their guests with the confidence of a woman who had found her footing in the shifting sands of London society. Lady Featherington approached, her smile tight but correct as she curtsied before the Duke and Duchess. Your Grace, she murmured to Anne, her tone carefully modulated to hide any lingering disapproval. A magnificent gathering. You've quite outdone yourself. Thank you, Lady Featherington, Anne replied graciously, choosing to accept the compliment at face value rather than search for hidden barbs. I'm so pleased you could attend. As the lady moved on, replaced by a seemingly endless procession of titled guests, Anne caught Sebastian watching her with undisguised pride. You've come into your own, Duchess, he murmured during a brief lull in the receiving line. London society never stood a chance against your determination. Anne smiled, the private expression they shared in moments of true connection. I had an excellent teacher in the art of social navigation, she replied. A certain duke who saw potential where others saw only a spinster with a talent for spilling tea. Sebastian laughed, the sound drawing curious glances from nearby guests unaccustomed to seeing the austere Duke of Ashbourne display such unguarded mirth. I believe that particular talent led to the happiest accident of my life. As the orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz, he turned to her with a formal bow that was belied by the warmth in his eyes. May I have the honor of this dance, Your Grace? Anne placed her hand in his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the course of their year together. Always, she replied simply. And as he led her onto the dance floor, the crowd parting respectfully before them, Anne realized that the greatest triumph of her unlikely journey from spinster to duchess was not the acceptance of society, the approval of the dowager, or even the successful management of her new responsibilities. It was this, the enduring love of the man who had seen beyond convention to the woman beneath, who had chosen her not despite her differences, but because of them, who continued to look at her with the same wonder and appreciation he had shown on the day they met. London society might whisper, Lady Whistledown might speculate, the ton might forever marvel at the unconventional match between the Duke of Ashbourne and the former Miss Anne Whitfield. But as Sebastian guided her through the steps of the waltz, his eyes never leaving hers, Anne knew with absolute certainty that she had found something far more precious than social acceptance or aristocratic approval. She had found home. In the arms of a duke who had defied convention to follow his heart, Anne Whitfield, once overlooked, now beloved, had discovered the greatest truth of all, that love, when genuine and brave, could overcome any obstacle, bridge any divide, and transform even the most unlikely of beginnings into the most beautiful of stories. And that was a truth worth any amount of spilled tea. 5 years after the wedding that had scandalized London society, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne hosted their annual midsummer garden party at their country estate in Derbyshire. The sprawling grounds of Ashbourne Hall were transformed for the occasion, with colorful tents dotting the manicured lawns, musicians playing beneath ancient oak trees, and tables laden with delicacies crafted by the Duke's French chef. It had become one of the most sought-after invitations of the season, partly due to the estate's legendary beauty, but primarily because of the warmth and unpretentious hospitality that had become the hallmark of the Duchess's entertaining style. Anne moved among her guests with practiced ease, her simple but elegant gown of periwinkle silk setting off the healthy glow of her complexion. At 35, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world and was content in it, the initial awkwardness of her first days as Duchess long since replaced by genuine assurance. She paused briefly to speak with Lady Danbury, whose initial skepticism had gradually transformed into grudging respect and eventually genuine friendship. Beside them, a small boy of about 4 years darted past, chasing a butterfly with single-minded determination, his dark curls and storm-gray eyes unmistakably marking him as the heir to the Ashbourne title. "James," Anne called, her tone fond but firm. "Walking, if you please. Remember what we discussed about proper behavior when we have guests." The child skidded to a halt, turning to his mother with a grin that was pure mischief. "Yes, Mama," he replied, moderating his pace to an exaggerated stroll that made Lady Danbury laugh out loud. "He has his father's looks and your spirit," the older woman observed, as James resumed his butterfly pursuit at a marginally more decorous pace. A formidable combination. "I fear for his future governesses," Anne agreed with a smile. "Sebastian claims he requires at least 3 to keep pace with the boy's energy." "And how is the Duke?" Lady Danbury inquired. "I haven't seen him yet this afternoon." "Attending to some business with Lord Winchester, I believe," Anne replied, "though he promised to join us shortly. You know how men are when they begin discussing politics or horseflesh." Lady Danbury nodded sagely. 2 topics of endless fascination to the male mind, surpassed only by the mysteries of the female sex. Anne laughed, about to respond when a commotion near the rose garden caught her attention. Her younger sister Beatrice, now a poised young woman of 22 and recently married to the Viscount Halloway, was gesturing excitedly in Anne's direction. Excusing herself from Lady Danbury, Anne made her way through the crowd, accepting greetings from guests as she passed. By the time she reached Beatrice, she found her sister practically vibrating with excitement. "What has you in such a state, Bea?" she asked, noting the high color in her sister's cheeks. "Not feeling unwell, I hope?" "Quite the contrary," Beatrice replied, her smile radiant. "I've just had confirmation from Dr. Winters. I'm with child." Anne's exclamation of joy drew curious glances from nearby guests, but she paid them no mind as she embraced her sister tightly. "Oh, Bea, that's wonderful news. Have you told Edward?" "Not yet," Beatrice admitted, referring to her husband. "I wanted you to be the first to know, after all your advice these past months." Anne squeezed her hands affectionately. "He'll be overjoyed. As am I. You'll make a wonderful mother." "I've had an excellent example to follow," Beatrice replied, glancing meaningfully toward young James, who was now engaged in serious conversation with his grandfather, Mr. Whitfield, near the lemonade table. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their exchange. Anne turned to see a familiar figure on horseback approaching from the direction of the estate's boundary, riding with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. Sebastian, Duke of Ashbourne, had aged like fine wine over the 5 years of their marriage. At 40, his dark hair was touched with the first strands of silver at the temples, lending him an air of distinguished maturity that only enhanced his natural authority. He dismounted with fluid ease, handing the reins to a waiting groom before making his way toward his wife and sister-in-law. "There you are," he said, bending to kiss Anne's cheek in a casual display of affection that still raised eyebrows among the more traditional members of society. "I apologize for my absence." Winchester had concerns about the new tariff proposal that could not wait, apparently. Politics at a garden party, Sebastian. Anne shook her head in mock disapproval. For shame. He smiled, the private expression that, even after 5 years, still made her heart skip a beat. "I assure you, the conversation was brief and entirely against my will. I'd much rather have been here, watching our son terrorize the guests." "He's been a perfect gentleman," Beatrice defended her nephew. "Well, nearly perfect." "High praise indeed," Sebastian laughed, turning to scan the crowd for James. "Ah, I see he's cornered his grandfather. Poor man. Our son's questions are relentless when he's curious about a topic." "Much like his father," Anne observed wryly. Sebastian's eyes returned to hers, warm with affection. "A trait he shares with both parents, I believe. Your curiosity was what first drew me to you, if you recall. That, and your refreshing tendency to speak your mind when others would dissemble." "You're remembering through the rose-tinted glass of retrospection," Anne replied, though she smiled at the memory. "I believe what first drew you to me was hot tea splashed across your waistcoat." "An unconventional introduction, but effective," he agreed, offering his arm to escort her back to the main gathering. "Shall we circulate, Duchess? I believe Lady Jersey is signaling rather desperately for your attention." Anne placed her hand on his sleeve, the gesture as natural as breathing, after years of partnership. "Go rescue James from his grandfather first," she suggested. "The poor man looks overwhelmed by whatever topic our son is currently expounding upon." As Sebastian made his way toward his son and father-in-law, Anne took a moment to simply observe the scene before her. The elegant guests scattered across the lawn, the sound of laughter and music mingling in the summer air, the sense of peace and belonging that had become her daily reality rather than a distant dream. If anyone had told Anne Whitfield, spinster and social disaster, that spilling tea on a duke would lead to this life of love, purpose, and fulfillment, she would have dismissed the notion as the height of absurdity. And yet, here she was, Duchess of Ashburn, mother to an active son and a daughter who had arrived 2 years after James. Respected patron of charities that made genuine differences in the lives of those less fortunate. Hostess to gatherings that were coveted for their warmth rather than mere social cachet. All because a man had looked beyond societal expectations to see the woman beneath, not perfect, not conventional, but real and alive in ways that had captured his heart against all odds. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of the Dowager Duchess, now approaching 70, but still regal in bearing and sharp of mind. The relationship between Anne and her mother-in-law had evolved over the years into one of genuine, if occasionally prickly, affection. "Your wool gathering, Anne," the Dowager observed, though her tone held no real censure. "Not like you to neglect your guests." Anne smiled, linking her arm through the older woman's. "Just taking a moment to appreciate," she replied honestly. "Sometimes I still can't quite believe this is my life." The Dowager's expression softened, a transformation that had become less rare as the years passed. "You've earned it, my dear, through dedication, intelligence, and a stubborn refusal to be anyone but yourself. High praise from you," Anne noted, genuinely touched by the words. "Merely the truth," the Dowager replied with characteristic directness. "Though I warn you, if you repeat it in company, I shall deny every word. I have a reputation for formidable standards to maintain." Anne laughed, the sound drawing Sebastian's attention from across the lawn. He approached with James in tow, the boy chattering animatedly about some new discovery. "Grandmother," James exclaimed, breaking free of his father's hand to throw his arms around the Dowager's skirts. "I found a frog by the pond, And father says I may keep it if I build a proper habitat. The dowager raised an eyebrow at her son, who shrugged unapologetically. I believe the exact words were, "a properly researched and constructed habitat with full responsibility for the creature's care," he clarified. A duke who knows his way around frogs, the dowager mused, her tone dry but her eyes twinkling with uncharacteristic humor. The Tun would be scandalized. The Tun has long since exhausted its capacity for scandal. "Where we're concerned, Mother," Sebastian replied, moving to stand beside Anne, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture of casual intimacy. As James continued to regale his grandmother with details of his amphibian discovery, Sebastian leaned closer to Anne, his voice low and meant for her ears alone. "Happy, Duchess." Anne turned to face him, taking in the features that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. The strong jaw, the intelligent eyes, the mouth that could curve from stern to tender in an instant. Beyond him, she could see their guests enjoying the afternoon, their daughter toddling after a peacock under the watchful eye of her nurse. The life they had built together unfolding in perfect, imperfect reality. "Completely," she replied, the simple word encompassing the journey that had brought them to this moment. A journey that had begun with a social disaster and led to the most unexpected and rewarding of destinations. Sebastian's smile deepened, creating the dimple in his left cheek that only appeared in moments of genuine happiness. "Good," he said softly, "because so am I. More than I ever imagined possible." And as they turned to rejoin their guests, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne presented a picture of contentment that required no explanation, no justification, no defense against society's expectations or judgments. They had written their own story, one that defied convention but embraced truth, one that proved that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings led to the most perfect endings, that sometimes a spilled cup of tea could change the world, or at least two hearts within it, that sometimes love was simply love, titles and expectations and society's rules be damned. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. Thank you for watching our Regency romance. If you enjoyed this story of love, scandal, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and share with friends who appreciate a good Duke and Spinster romance. Leave a comment below with your favorite scene. Was it the tea incident, the garden proposal, or perhaps the Dowager Duchess's eventual approval? Your support means the world,